It's really an honor to be here with you today, and in the brief time that we have together, I do want to talk about some of the issues affecting policing today. It was mentioned that I have served for a long period of time in policing. I'm in my 47th year. I spent... I'm a native Chicagoan, born and raised. I spent 30 years as a member of the Chicago Police Department. I left to become police chief in Washington, D.C. I served there for 9 years, and now I've had the honor and privilege of serving under Mayor Michael Nutter here in the great city of Philadelphia for the last 7.5 years. So I've got a lot of experience, and I've gone through a lot of transitions that have taken place over the course of my career in the profession of policing. But I have to admit that I have not experienced anything quite as challenging as where we find ourselves today. All you have to do is turn on the nightly news or watch one of the cable broadcasts, and I can almost guarantee you that you're going to see a video from somewhere in the United States showing an action being taken by a police officer somewhere that, quite frankly, in some instances, I find to be appalling. That's the environment that we find ourselves in today. And all of that affects our ability to build trust in many communities. Now, there's been a lot of talk about trust in communities, particularly communities of color. Let me start off by saying that when I started my policing career in the late 1960s, early 1970s in Chicago, there were some communities that we went into where there was tension, where we didn't get anybody willing to talk to us about what may have taken place or what have you. So it's been something that's really been bubbling beneath the surface for a long period of time, and occasionally it does boil over. I mean, those of you old enough to remember some of the riots that we've had in various cities around the country, some of it starts through actions of police that get out of control, and we wind up with civil unrest as a result. So even though this is something that maybe we've experienced in the past, I don't think we've experienced it quite like we are today. And that's what I want to talk about. There are two areas I want to cover. This is a complex issue and certainly takes a lot more time than what we have allotted here, but I just want to cover a couple things that I think maybe is a part of what we see going on, and then also come up with a couple of ideas on how we can repair the damage. The first is history, the history of policing in the United States. When we really go back in time, and Philadelphia was, the Philadelphia Police Department was organized in 1797. We're the oldest police department in the United States of America. But policing actually goes back even further than that. I mean, there was a period of time when you had unpaid watchmen and constables just walking down the street trying to keep neighborhoods as safe as they could. You had police that worked on plantations. Their job was to track down slaves that had run away. So one of the things that we started doing here just recently in Philadelphia was beginning a program with the National Constitution Center right here in Philadelphia. Because what I wanted to do was create a training program that really talked about history. Now, the National Constitution Center obviously is there to really talk about the Constitution, how our democracy has evolved, all those kinds of things. But just as our democracy has evolved, so has policing. And I think it's important for our young people coming into the profession, including our veteran officers that have been around for a while, to understand that history. So it starts with a discussion around 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And it's not so much a history lesson of how our union came to be what it is, but it's also a snapshot in time where we talk about if you were a policeman during that period of time, what are some of the things you might have been doing? Well, as I said before, maybe you were just a watchman walking down the street trying to make sure that the doors were locked or whatever and people were safe and secure. But you might have been one of those individuals chasing down slaves. Fast forward to the civil rights period of time. Who was it that was enforcing Jim Crow laws of the time? Who was it that people encountered on Bloody Sunday when they walked across that bridge? Police. I think it's important for us to know the history and to understand that police have not always stood on the right side of justice as we define justice today. It's just a reality. And whereas I'd like to think we have evolved, and we have, but there are still a lot of baggage that we carry. And so when you look at different communities and you wonder why there's mistrust, you wonder why, people really are afraid of police. A lot of it has to do with history. When I was police chief in Washington, D.C., we had communities immigrant communities, first generation, that had come to our city, many from Central America. No matter what the situation, if they were a victim of a crime, knew about a crime or whatever, they often would not call the police. Why? Because police in their country were incredibly oppressive and they were afraid. So it's not just policing in the United States we need to think about and the impact it has on communities. It's actually elsewhere. In 1998, when I was chief in D.C., I had occasion to visit the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. It was just one of those things on my schedule. I was a brand new chief, and everybody's trying to get to know you, and someone who turned out to be a very good friend of mine, David Friedman from the Anti-Defamation League, invited me to visit the museum. So I went. It was absolutely the most powerful experience I had had to that date, to that point in time. And when I left there, because I was being accompanied by an actual survivor, and as we're going through the museum, she's actually telling me her personal story, her and her family during that period of time. So when I left there, and I was going to catch a plane to fly to Chicago to visit family, but I was really haunted by that experience. So I came back about a week later, unannounced, where I could take my time and walk through the museum. And then I began to understand what was bothering me. Many of the pictures, and those of you that have been to that museum, the pictures that you see there oftentimes include police officers working alongside soldiers, participating in those horrific events that took place. Now, I never knew that. I didn't know it when I went through school, high school, the Holocaust was glossed over. It was part of history, but nobody spent any time talking about it, believe me. Of course, history wasn't my favorite subject. I might not have been paying attention. But in any event, I knew about the Holocaust, but I didn't know about the role of police, and it made me start thinking. Germany had been a democratic society. What happened? They probably took an oath very similar to the one that I took. So what happened? How could they possibly then be involved in not just rounding up Jews, but actually participating in death squads, on death squads, and so forth? And I just couldn't get my head around it. But then it sparked an idea. What is the role of police in a democratic society? If you ask the average police officer what their role is, most of them would say to enforce the laws. Yet that is a very, very narrow part of what we do as police. How many of them do you think would actually say that their role is to defend the constitutional rights of all people? If we had police in this country believe it and conduct themselves in a manner consistent with that, would we be having the problems we're having today? I don't think so. So by taking that walk through history, because we've already tried doing the so-called sensitivity training, something that I absolutely hate that term, is it implies that you're insensitive, or you go in there with the presumption that, white cops are all racist and blah, blah, blah. People shut down. They don't want to hear that kind of stuff. But it's a backdoor approach toward getting at many of the legitimate issues that confront us today. One of the photographs, for an example, is a soldier and a police officer going through a Jewish man, and the first thing it reminded me of was stop and frisk. I mean, the lessons go on, and I'm not trying to say police are Nazis or police are involved in that sort of thing, but it's about the Constitution. It's about protecting people's rights. And that's the message we try to get through to people as part of this training that we're doing at the National Constitution Center. The other thing that I think is important that kind of got us to where we are today are, quite frankly, the policing strategies that we've used. I saw an earlier presentation when they talked about the 80s and the 90s. I went through that when crime was soaring through the roof. And I'm telling you, there was an awful lot of pressure from political leadership and also from communities. Get a handle on crime. We were just beginning to engage in something called community-oriented policing, which would bring police and community closer together, engage in collaborative problem solving, and all these kinds of things. And was it good? Yeah, absolutely. It built much better relationships in many of our communities. But it was a little slow in terms of actually being able to see that reduction in crime. And let's face it, at the end of the year, when you pick up the newspaper, or if you turn on television and they're talking about crime in Philly, Baltimore, or anywhere else, what are they showing? One stat and one stat only. How many murders did you have? If your murders are up, crime's out of control. Murders are down, fantastic, great job. I can have my job another year, probably. But is that really the barometer that we ought to be using to determine safe and secure neighborhoods? I would argue that it's really not. People want more than that. So we went from community-oriented policing, and then we all started looking at New York City, where they went into something called CompStat, which is a data-driven approach to dealing with crime. And they had dramatic reductions in crime. So everyone started saying, how come you aren't doing what they're doing there? So across America, we all started getting the information systems. We all started looking at dots on the map. We all started looking at our deployments and how we're putting cops in the areas where we have the most crime and so forth. And then we all started to see drops in crime. I mean, we are at the lowest level of crime in this country in most cities since the late 1950s and early 1960s. That's pretty dramatic, folks, pretty dramatic. But here's the problem. We didn't think about the collateral damage we were causing in many of these communities by some of the aggressive policing tactics. We also, I think, misunderstood what people really want. Sure, they want safe and secure neighborhoods, but they don't measure success solely by the absence of crime. They also want to see the presence of justice in communities. We missed that. So we started looking at these maps. We got all the dots and we got all these things, and we're driving down crime and everybody's patting us on the back. Oh, yeah, you're doing a great job, so forth and so on. But it's very important, and I'm not saying that's a bad approach. It's not. I mean, there's criticism about broken windows, taking care of smaller crimes and that sort of thing. Well, that's what people complain about. And you live in these neighborhoods, you're concerned about quality of life. Our problem was we didn't have a strategy in place on what to do once the window was repaired. And if what you're doing is effective, eventually it's no longer broken. So do you use the same strategies you used to get it to a manageable point in time? Or do you start to then engage more? One of my deputies mentioned that whereas we have a lot of research being done on the various kinds of policing, and it seems like every time we come up with a new strategy, we got to come up with a name for it. So it's like hotspot policing or problem-oriented policing or what. Everybody's got to kind of put a label on something. And these are effective strategies because it does reduce crime, but we don't measure, again, what's the attitude of people in that community once we leave. If we make 100 stops of individuals in an area looking for weapons, we find one weapon. That's good. We got one gun off the street. But now we've alienated perhaps 99 others. Who wins in that one? It sure as heck ain't us. So we need to kind of rethink. And not that we don't want to continue to do things that are proven, but we've got to build those relationships. We've got to build that trust. We've got to do the things we need to do to bring the community along with us. And also accept the fact that some communities, certain things just aren't acceptable, and that's fine. We're public servants. We have to have a service mentality. So it's history. It's about the kinds of strategies, but it's also about mindset. And I'm talking about mindset of police. Community mindset needs to change a little bit too, but I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about police specifically. You probably have heard some talk about how we need to move from a warrior mentality to a guardian mentality. I agree with that. We're not at war with anybody. We're there to protect. We're there to serve. That's fine. But there's got to go beyond that, because how we see ourselves really drives how we behave. I'll give you an example. There's a metaphor in policing, and all of you have probably heard it. It's called a thin blue line. I don't think there's anybody in here that probably hadn't heard that used back and forth. Never really gave it any real thought, but, I bought into it as a young cop. After my visit to the Holocaust Museum, I said, no, we're not a thin blue line. We're not a line of any kind. We aren't something that separates good from evil. I see us as more of a thread woven throughout the communities that we serve, helping to hold together the very fabric of democracy. And we have as much responsibility protecting the rights of those that have committed or accused of committing a crime as we do law-abiding people who are just the victims of crime. That's our responsibility as police. So we get away from that us against them type of mentality. The other thing we have to do is deal with the real issue of bias. Now, we've started new training in our department, Fair and Impartial Policing. Dr. Lori Friedel from the University of South Florida has a great program. We've had her up. We're in the process of doing that now, recognizing that everyone has a bias of some kind. Could be gender, could be sexual orientation, could be race, could be political affiliation, could be a lot of things. The real question for us is, knowing that we have them, how then do we manage it so it doesn't influence or impact how we do our job? And that's a valuable lesson for all of us in our business. But part of the problem that I see, and it happens in my own agency, it's happened everywhere I've worked, is that police officers, many, and most of them do a great job, but there are a significant number that just don't show the kind of respect they need to show for the communities that they serve. And I'm going to tell just a brief story as I end this that kind of drives home the importance of respect. When I was a sergeant working narcotics in Chicago, I had a guy that worked for me named Paris Patton. And Paris was one of these guys that, he could sweet talk anybody. He was a guy that even though we would hit a raid, narcotics raid, and back in those days, you literally hit the door with a sledgehammer, all kinds of chaos, people, you're trying to isolate folks so you can make sure they don't have weapons or whatever, and it was pretty chaotic. But by the time that was over, Paris had everybody calmed down and may have even developed an informant. And what I would ask him, and I did ask him one time, was, man, how do you do it? Because you talk about, so I know people that can pour, gasoline on a fire, but he was just the opposite. He could calm down anybody. And he said, it's really very simple. He said, at the moment of birth, every person is a perfect 10. But deduct 3 right away, because life is temporary, does not last forever. If you are born into a dysfunctional family where there's substance abuse, domestic violence, deduct another 3. Because the environment you're in now, you don't have the kind of role model that you need to have. It's going to be very difficult for you to make it. He said, if you're a member of a minority group, deduct another 3. Because some doors may not be open to you that are open for others. He said, that leaves 1. That 1 is that person's dignity and self-respect. He said, do what you have to do as a police officer, but never, ever do anything to take away that person's dignity or self-respect, because that's all they got left, and they will fight you to hold on to it. I never forgot that. And I've always tried to just go through my career and my contacts and my daily activities with that in mind and try to make sure that I talk about that as often as I can. Because a big part of the problem and the reason why we have such strained relationships, quite frankly, is just the interaction that takes place on a daily basis. Now, when you think about 18,000 police departments, 500,000 law enforcement officers, there have got to be tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of contacts every single day. But all it takes is just a few videos to change the entire dynamic. We have to hold police officers accountable, but we also have to deal with the very real issue we have with a disproportionate amount of crime and violence occurring in some of our communities. How do we fix that? So it's going to take a collective effort on all our parts. We got to stop the finger pointing and the blame and sit down and really come up with a solution, a strategy to start to have a solid impact. So our young people can grow up in an environment where they feel safe and secure. They can be educated. They can go out here and find decent paying jobs to be able to support their families. Will there be a few fall off the rails? Yeah, but there always has been. But we can minimize the number, and we can have a dramatic impact on what we see going out there now. A lot of the burden is on us, me as a police leader, but some of the burden and much of the burden is on all of you too, because collectively we sink or swim together. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time and your attention, and God bless you.